Good evening. My name is Don Hannon, and I'm the Acting Executive Director for the St. Louis Kaplan Feldman Holocaust Museum. I'm honored to welcome you to this inaugural program in the Why This Matters speaker series. At the heart of this series is the museum's mission to use the history and the lessons of the Holocaust to reject hatred, promote understanding, and inspire change. The Why This Matters series demonstrates why the St. Louis community has so strongly supported the museum for over 25 years and has helped to make its expansion a reality. Each program in this four-part series will cover issues central to the work of the museum. These crucial topics, anti-Semitism, Holocaust education, and media literacy, will be fully integrated into the curriculum and programs at the new museum, which will reopen in the summer of 2022, one short year from now. The topic of today's program, anti-Semitism, cannot be more timely. Not only is anti-Semitism on the rise around the world, but a recent study found that 60% of Americans believed at least one anti-Semitic trope. We could not think of a better person to set the record straight and speak to the dangers of anti-Semitism than Mark Weitzman. Now, to introduce our speaker will be our long-term and soon-to-retire curator and director of education, Dan Rich.
Thank you, Don, and good evening, everyone. Before I introduce our speaker, let me again say that if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. It's been my pleasure to know our speaker for over 20 years through our affiliation with the AHO, the Association of Holocaust Organizations. And for years, I've been saying that I want to bring him to St. Louis. I'm happy that he's here even by Zoom, but I do hope you'll come again, and hopefully there will be cardinal tickets involved. Mark Weitzman is Director of Government Affairs for the Simon Wiesenthal Center and is also Chief Representative of the Center to the United Nations. He is a member of the official U.S. delegation to the International Holocaust Remembrance Authority, IHRA, where he chaired the Committee on Anti-Semitism and Holocaust Denial, and is currently chairing the Working Group on Holocaust Museums and Memorials. He was described by the London Jewish Chronicle as the architect of IHRA's 2016 adoption of the Working Definition of Antisemitism, which is the first definition of anti-Semitism with any formal status, and I think we'll be hearing more about that. He also was a lead author of IHRA's Working Definition of Holocaust Denial and Distortion, which was adopted by the 34-member countries of IHRA in 2013. Mark Weitzman has testified in the US Congress, met with world leaders, including UN Secretary Generals Kofi Annan, Ban Ki-moon, and Antonio Guterres, and been a featured speaker at 3 UN conferences on anti-Semitism and extremism. He was one of the Jewish leaders to meet with Popes Benedict and Francis on their US visits. He was a winner of the 2007 National Book Award for Best Anthology for Anti-Semitism, The Generic Hatred, Essays in Memory of Simon Wiesenthal, which he co-edited and contributed to, and which has appeared in French, Spanish, and Russian editions. He was a co-author of An End to Anti-Semitism, a catalog of policies to combat anti-Semitism that was presented to the European Union in 2019. His book, Dismantling the Big Lie, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was co-authored with Stephen Jacobs, was the first full refutation of the infamous protocols that was published in 2003 and has been translated into Arabic and Japanese. His chapter, The Transmigration of Anti-Semitism, Old Myths, New Realities, appeared in the volume Not Your Father's Anti-Semitism, The Hatred of Jews in the Early 21st Century, which was published in 2008. He also is a contributor to the Encyclopedia of Genocide and Crimes Against Humanity from 2004, and has overseen the Wiesenthal Center's annual electronic report, Digital Hate and Terrorism, which he put out from 2000 to 2019. He has been recognized for his work by the US Army, the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, and also served as the historical advisor to the Marvel Comics graphic novel, X-Men Magneto Testament. It is my great pleasure to welcome Mark Weitzman.
Thank you very much, Dan. It's really a pleasure to finally be, at least virtually, in St. Louis. And I want to thank you and Don and Amy for the invitation to be there. I'm really excited about and looking forward to seeing the results of the new museum, the plans coming to fruition. It sounds extraordinarily thoughtful, and I think it will, every chance, put St. Louis Holocaust Museum into the front ranks of museums in the United States. So very much looking forward to it and learning more about that as it goes along. And on a personal note, Dan, we've known each other for quite a long time, and I will tell you that we will miss you, the field will miss you, I will miss you. I hope you that get to enjoy the retirement that you so richly deserve, but it will be with more than a tinge of regret when you close the door behind you, that I think all of us will feel. I want to begin with something that you mentioned. I was thinking as you went through that introduction, which is something my mother would have loved, that one of the books that you referenced was called Anti-Semitism, the Generic Hatred. In some ways, I think, regret that choice of words, that description today. I don't know if I would call anti-Semitism a generic hatred anymore. I think that there are many facets of it. Obviously, every form of hate, every form of stereotyping and so on is unique in its own way, and has certain characteristics that it shares with others. But I think there are things about anti-Semitism that set it apart. And maybe that's a good way of beginning, is thinking about some of the aspects of anti-Semitism. And first of all, to note that anti-Semitism in the United States in the last 3 years or so, 3-4 years, has skyrocketed in terms of its impact and effect on Jews, on the non-Jewish world. I don't have to look any further. We don't have to look any further than the headlines this past week about a swastika being found in the State Department, initiating strong responses from President Biden and Secretary Blinken, the appointment of the very first ambassador level special envoy on anti-Semitism, our good friend Deborah Lipstadt, Professor Deborah Lipstadt of Emory. We'll have something more to say about that perhaps a little bit later. And that certainly is it's a first in American history. We've had some 4 special envoys before her. We did not have anyone with the status of ambassador at that level. How do we get to that point? How does it now that anti-Semitism has all of a sudden erupted on the American scene, let alone on the international scene, in a way that I think, frankly, honestly, none of us would have anticipated a number of years ago. So I'm going to try to do a couple of things tonight. I'm going to try to do a very quick kind of historical overview of anti-Semitism, and then segue into its appearances in different ways in the United States in particular. Is noticeable for a couple of things. One, it's very tip of the iceberg. Anybody who deals with this issue will tell you that the information the FBI gathers it's not required. Only a very small number of precincts and police forces actually report their statistics to the FBI, and it's really underreports, is an underreporting of the status of the statistics that we have. But they do show that in the area regarding hate crimes that are religiously based on religion, not race, not ethnic origin necessarily, not gender identity or any of those issues, but in terms of religion-based hate crimes, Jews were targeted in 2019, which was the last year that statistics were available, for, and obviously it takes a while for statistics to be reported and collected, were targeted approximately 60% of all religious-based hate crimes were aimed at Jews. The next highest were Muslims, who were approximately 12 or 13%. So an overwhelmingly number of religiously based hate crimes in the United States from 2019 were aimed at Jews. And we don't have to look any further than remember what happened at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. That's the image that you can see there. The Poway shooting, the murder in Jersey City, just the number of attacks on Jews that culminated that year in the worst spate of murderous violence against Jews in American history. So there's clearly something going on that had an impact. I also want to tie it into the start of the pandemic. And again, as you can remember, perhaps, or just as a reminder, from the very beginning of the appearance, there was both an uptick in conspiracy and belief in conspiracy theories that were associated not only with the pandemic, but with all sorts of issues. And again, we're seeing that play out in our political world, in our social world, online and social media and so on, how powerful conspiracy theories are in today's world. And conspiracy theories are extraordinarily often linked to anti-Semitism. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which we'll come back to, was perhaps the prototypical Bible of conspiracy myths. But we also have it now associated with the coronavirus. And here is just one image of thousands that could have been taken of a stereotypical Jew with a big nose, with the words Mashiach now. Evidently, whoever made this image was exposed to at one point the Lubavitch Hasidim, who have that phrase talking about their late Rebbe, Menachem Schneerson, and use the phrase Mashiach now. So they associate the one sect of ultra-Orthodox Hasidic Jews, Lubavitch, with all Jews, but have the association with the hook nose and so on. And you could see the linkage there. And again, I mentioned conspiracy theories. Who made coronavirus? Was it the US, Israel, or China itself? This is a former, someone with a PhD who's showing it. And then, give a hug if you have the bug, or get your coronavirus today, that the coronavirus, the shots aimed at preventing the virus as a public health measure were a part of a Jewish plot. And I don't have to dwell on these. I think you're all familiar with them and seen them. But where do they originate? How do they get there? Why are these tropes playing on? And for here, I want to start doing our return into history, so to speak. And if you go back, you can see this is from the 13th century, associated with the Black Death, and it shows Jews being burnt. And if you go all the way back and look at the images associated with that period, you will see that a lot of them have the concept that Jews were responsible for the plague, partly because Jews had different sanitary measures. Observant Jews had rules about ritual washing, about slaughter, that kept germs not totally at bay at that point, but certainly they minimized them compared to the general population. So Jews sometimes escaped the worst of the plague. As a result, in a superstitious world that was rife for conspiracy and looking to blame, they were the scapegoats chosen to be blamed for the spread of the plague, and sometimes, as a result, could even be burnt to death. And here you see tuberculosis, syphilis, cancer, all being blamed on the Jews. And again, see that image with the hook nose? And this was taken, the last image was taken from an coronavirus rally in Columbus, Ohio. Certainly as much of a heartland in the United States as St. Louis is. Again, just to reinforce the image, 1349, poisoning of the wells. The figure of a Christ-like figure punctuated by puncture holes that drip blood into the wells by Jews, part of the Jewish plot. Here again, Jews are being burned at the stake as a result of it. And this was because the image, the ground had been laid by a deeply held and widely held belief in originating Catholicism, which at that time was obviously the only form of Christianity that had, that kind of range and power. And here's Pope Innocent III from the 12th century saying that the Jews by their own guilt are consigned to perpetual servitude because they crucified the Lord. In other words, the Jews had become a degenerate people. They were sent a savior that they rejected, killed, committed the act of deicide. So this degenerate people committed the act of deicide. They were damned by that very action. And they were condemned to eternal damnation, dispersion, diaspora, until they finally recognized the coming of Jesus, the second coming. The idea there being that the Jews had become really the scapegoat and the evil figure behind anything in the Christian world. And as such, this type of typology, of stereotyping, became really the reigning impulse in early medieval Christianity, and laid the seeds for a lot of the anti-Semitism that was to follow. We could see it not only in verbal, it was not only in text, it became nonverbal as well. Many of the classics of art in the Western world, if you look closely at them, a lot of them have anti-Semitic stereotypes and images. These were taken from two churches. One is in Germany, and it shows, again, the symbolism is the synagogue and ecclesiastic of the church, shows the church in white on a innocent sheep with an upright staff, clear-eyed, erect, triumphant, while the Jews' staff is broken. They're on a broken back ass. They're blindfolded. And the same thing came through a couple of years ago in the summer. There was a massive destructive fire at the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. And I think I certainly, along with many other people, were transfixed watching the efforts to save this masterpiece and symbol of Western culture. But I was struck by the fact that at the same time that everyone was working to save it, I don't know how many people were aware, and even I don't think anyone ever commented on it, that above one of the doors of Notre Dame were the same synagogue and ecclesia, the broken synagogue, the triumphant church. And everyone who passed this, and everyone who passed any other medieval cathedral, or the Strasbourg or Worms or any place like that, they could have been illiterate. But the images spoke and transmitted a message that Christianity was triumphant, was pure, had inherited God's blessings. Jews were broken, blinded, and inherited God's curses. And that was a seed that was planted for years. Finally, in the 16th century, when Martin Luther came along and revolted against the Catholic Church, Luther originally appealed to Jews. He thought that they would join him in his campaign against Catholicism, and he was astounded when they didn't. Jews had their own image of Luther. Some of them actually, one medieval Kabbalist, for example, wrote that Luther was heralding the beginning of the Messianic age, because he would topple the Catholic Church, and that would then be a sign that the Messiah was really coming for Jews. However, Luther had other ideas, and when the Jews rejected his overtures, Luther turned into an incredibly virulent anti-Semite, to use an anachronism because the term was not present at that time, but became a vicious enemy of Jews. And on the Jews and their lies, he wrote, and this is just scary when you realize that he was writing in Germany approximately 400 years before the Holocaust and before the Third Reich began. And look what he wrote: synagogues and schools should be set on fire, prayer books destroyed, rabbis forbidden to preach, homes razed, property and money confiscated. Finally, these poisonous and venomous worms should be drafted into forced labor or expelled for all time. It is, you don't like to be historians, and I was trained as a historian, don't like to be so determinative and say, there's a simple straight line from someone who said something 400 years earlier to a catastrophe, a genocidal catastrophe like the Holocaust. But it is very scary and prescient to look at Luther's words and wonder how and what kind of impact they did have as they germinated through the centuries into German society. So that was one form of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism had begun and grown in a theological setting as part of the effort for Christianity to set itself apart and set itself as triumphant and over the Jews. That was later called the teachings of contempt. In the meantime, in the 19th century, science began to speak as loud, if not louder, than religion. And there was the advent, particularly after Darwin, of those who were looking at evolution, at races of humanity, at different forms of the animal world, and creating taxonomies and so on and so forth. And eventually, some people took those teachings of Darwinism, turned them into social Darwinism, into an attempt to create a hierarchy of races, putting the white, Aryan, Anglo-Saxon race on top, and then putting Jews or people in color in either evil or inferior positions. This was one of them, a Frenchman named Arthur de Gobineau, The Equality of Human Races, 1854, and he says very clearly, no true civilization where the Aryan branch is not predominant. He was one of a number of people, including a man named Houston Stewart Chamberlain, who wrote a massive work in the early part of the 20th century. And Chamberlain is quite important when it comes to this history, because he was the son-in-law of the German composer Richard Wagner, whose anti-Semitism was also, was notorious for his anti-Semitism. And Chamberlain took it into a more, again, racially scientific, to use that, pseudo-scientific term. And there was also a link with Hitler. Chamberlain was a very big influence on Adolf Hitler later on. In the meantime, when you come to the United States, you have another form of anti-Semitism becoming very popular through the efforts of one of the giants of the 20th century, in many ways, Henry Ford, the man who created U.S. industry, the car industry. Ford, at one point, decided to take his Dearborn Independent, the newspaper that he was running, and do a series on it called The International Jew, the World's Foremost Problem. And he basically published it. That's the original version, the original track version of it. It was a sort of a condensed form of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It was published in 2 volumes. And this was the advent of conspiratorial anti-Semitism. It alleged that Jewish hateful, harmful streams of influence upon society are all, behind them are all Jews. Ford later had to apologize. He was threatened with libel. There were court suits. He was, a subpoena was served upon him, which he really desperately tried to avoid. And so he finally ended up apologizing, claiming that, he had made a mistake, tried to pull back the publications of it, but the damage had been done. He had seeded anti-Semitism, not just in the United States, but again, Ford had a huge influence on Hitler. There was a relationship there where Hitler idolized Ford, and Ford had some strong relations with the German government at one point. And I just went backwards instead of forwards, so please bear with me while I try to catch up. So I want to go here straight into, as we're leading up to the Nazi period. This is a children's book called The Poison Mushroom, The Gift Pills. It was published by the publishing house of the Sturmer, which was basically the crudest, most vulgar form of anti-Semitism that even the Nazi hierarchy was embarrassed by their work sometime. And in it, I just want to show you some images because you'll see, whoops, I actually made a mistake there. Hang on to that image for a second. This is also from Nazi imagery. This is still from one of their major propaganda films, their Ivor Guyuta, The Eternal Jew from 1940. And the image is taken from a scene of where it's discussing rats and vermin creating plague and bringing illness and disease and contagion to Europe. And it shows just a horde of rats spilling out of the sewers of Europe. And the inference is clear. The rats are the Jews are the rats, and they are poisoning Europe. And again, this is a Polish Nazi propaganda poster from Poland that blames Jews for typhus, which was widespread during World War II because, again, the lack of sanitary conditions. But once again, Jews are being blamed for it. This goes back to those images of the Black Plague and where we started with the Corona issue. And here again, part of the issue of anti-Semitism is blaming certain prominent Jews alleging that they are behind the scenes, they are controlling or ruining the world. One of the prominent figures in today's world is George Soros, who not just in the United States, not just in the political circles in the United States, but in places like Poland, Hungary, and so on, is blamed for all sorts of issues, particularly because of his involvement in liberal politics, his funding of liberal initiatives, and so on. Now, again, I want to stress here, this is not a defense of George Soros in a large scale. There are many things I personally disagree with George Soros on his stance about Israel and Zionism. He is not exactly as favorable to those as I am. And I think that he's wrong basically on that and perhaps other issues as well. But when you have somebody who you blame for everything from the coronavirus to the destruction of society because he represents a shadowy figure of a Jewish banker, this is just today's version of the Rothschilds. Earlier, again, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, these shadowy Jewish figures who are out to destroy traditional culture, undermine the world, and are blamed for everything. And that's a stereotype that's absolutely anti-Semitic. And that's where the distinction has to be made. So I want to fast forward now, or not fast forward, but move a little bit quicker into today's world. So I gave you some ways of a little bit of a really short summary of history of anti-Semitism, but enough to see that anti-Semitism appeared in certain ways. It appeared in religious form. It appeared in the racial science form. By the way, that's where the term anti-Semitism came from. The man who was credited with originating it, perhaps he didn't, but the one who publicized it certainly, who was a German publicist named Wilhelm Marr, toward the end of the 19th century, was looking for a more scientific sounding term for the Jew hatred that was used at that time that he associated with the vulgar masses. He wanted something that was more intellectually legitimate, that would sound better, that would play better in the elite circles of society, whether it's parliament or the press or or government and so on. And so he hit upon anti-Semitism using a false taxonomy of races, creating this anti-Semitic, this group of Semitic people, and that's one of the reasons why most experts in the field will only spell anti-Semitism without the hyphen, because there is no Semitism. There is no, it's an artificial construction that basically plays into the meaning that Wilhelm Marr tried to assign to it and is or should be rejected today. So there's religious, there's racial, there's the conspiratorial anti-Semitism of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which alleged in 26 protocols that were published around the turn of the 20th century that a shadowy group of Jewish elders were meeting in Basel, Switzerland, and plotting to take over the world. The rulers of Europe were their shadow figures that were being blackmailed to do their bidding, and they were going to corrupt the press, the population, education, women, etc., all for their nefarious means. That's essentially the background of the protocols, supported by Henry Ford. There was even the counter religious form that took place from the Enlightenment, from Voltaire, who rejected revealed religion at that time, which essentially was an attack on Christianity as corrupt intellectually and morally. But Voltaire then decided that the source of the revealed religion, Christianity, was actually the Hebrew Bible. So he turned his sights on Jews and Judaism as well, and just wrote, again, some overtly anti-Semitic statements and teachings that led even the enlightened, some major Enlightenment figures, into embracing anti-Semitism and propagating it. So you have all these forms of anti-Semitism out there. You had historians working on it from the mid-20th century on, particularly after the advent of the Nazis. Why do we now talk about a definition of anti-Semitism today? Why do we end up with and again, I'm not sure if you've been following this, but there's even been some controversy over which anti-Semitism definition, where it came from, and so on and so forth. And that's where I want to spend the remaining time that we have together. So I want to begin by saying that there was an attempt in 2004 by a group of Jewish and non-Jewish experts working with a European Union human rights agency, created an anti-Semitism, a working definition of anti-Semitism that was posted on the website of this human rights arm of the EU, but never officially adopted or anything like that. And then in about 2013 or so, it was scrubbed. They were doing some work. They said, we never adopted it. We're taking off everything that was never officially adopted. Maybe there were politics involved. I'm not really sure about that. But they got rid of it, and this definition was sort of floating around with nothing to hang on, and there was nothing there, essentially. 2014, this synagogue, summer of 2014 in Wuppertal, Germany. We all lived through, just a couple of, barely a month and a half ago, a war in Gaza and the impact and the effect that it had in the United States. This was an earlier version of the same thing. Summer of 2014, there was another war in Gaza. And as a result, this synagogue, which was rebuilt after the Nazi period, was firebombed. And you could see the Molotov cocktails here, some of the damage. 3 people were arrested of Middle Eastern origin. They confessed. They said they were doing it because they were upset about Israel's actions in Gaza. And so they firebombed the local synagogue. A German court and then a German appeals court said that these cannot be considered as hate crimes. They are just, after all, political protests. And there was an uproar that resulted from that. And the uproar was basically based on the concept that how can you not call an attack on a synagogue with people who have nothing to do with the Israeli government, an arson attack, the firebombing, how can you not call that an act of anti-Semitism? Now, I'm going to begin here with my involvement and where Dan alluded to earlier. Starting in 2000, I have been part of the State Department delegation to something called, what's now called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IHRA. IHRA, or IHRA, is now up to 34 countries. It began with about 5 or 6. And it began as an effort to bring countries together. This followed the late 1990s attempts to get some of the restitution kick-started with Swiss banks and insurance companies, and a lot of other governments began to finally open up their archives and look at the implications of what had happened in the name of those countries and governments during World War II, and how Jews were targeted and really both despoiled and murdered with complicity in the name of some of these governments and countries. One aspect of that began to focus on education about the Holocaust, and IHRA was formed to help further an international effort to increase Holocaust education using the benefits of the countries in the West, such as Israel, the United States, the United Kingdom, and so on, who had been studying the subject for years to help the countries that were just coming out of from behind the Iron Curtain, countries like Poland, Hungary, Lithuania, Slovakia, and so on and so forth. So it began with a focus on 3 efforts on academic research and education, on museums and memorials work. And in 2010, it added a focus on anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial, which had always been a part of it, but it upgraded to another major focus. I had chaired the Committee on Anti-Semitism and Holocaust Denial for a number of years. And the idea was, as we were working on these issues, we realized that we were bringing together in one room, at one table, experts from varying professions and disciplines, historians, educators, museum people, NGO, Jewish communal workers, plus diplomats from countries of greatly differing societies, some who were not necessarily so conversant in English, and we were expecting everyone to understand exactly what we were talking about so we could work on it and tackle these subjects. And so we began with Holocaust denial, and we created a working definition of Holocaust denial that took 5 years to get adopted. It took 5 years because everything that IHRA adopts, and remember, IHRA is an international political association. It has some formal status. It means governments are not legally bound to it, but they make political commitments that they're expected to uphold by the other governments involved. So there's a level of responsibility. Delegations are headed by senior diplomats, and to apply, the application has to come, the official letter comes from the foreign minister, sometimes the head of state, that high level of involvement. So To get something through, it's done by consensus, meaning every country has to sign off on it. Every country has to agree. One country blocks or refuses it. It's finished. It doesn't work. So it took us 5 years to get a working definition of Holocaust denial and distortion through, because Holocaust denial was very easy. If you follow the news about the appointment of Deborah Listrat, you'll know that one of the highlights of her career was her defeat of the pseudo-historian and anti-Semite David Irving in a British court. And after that, hardcore Holocaust denial was marginalized in many places, other than in places like Iran and so on. But Holocaust distortion, which claims that the Holocaust doesn't deny the Holocaust happened, but says, well, maybe the locals didn't do it, the Germans were the only ones responsible, or not as many died as you think, or maybe Jews contributed to it. All sorts of ways to sort of evade responsibility. That was much more problematic. So it took 5 years of intense lobbying to get that done. And when we were finished, we looked around, and in 2013, after it was adopted in October in Canada, we looked around, a couple of us, and said, you know what, the next step is to get this definition of anti-Semitism through, so we have, again, this common basis and understanding of what anti-Semitism is, to be able to tackle it on the international level. So it took another 3-4 years to get it through. In 2016 in Budapest, in Bucharest, under the chairmanship of Romania, led by a wonderful diplomat who unfortunately died a number of years ago, shortly after he achieved this passage, Ambassador Mihnea Constantinescu, and we came up with this non-legally binding working definition of anti-Semitism, and that's what I want to focus on. Yes.
Hate to interrupt, but you're echoing quite a bit. Could you maybe try to mute or unmute or check your mic? It started a couple of minutes ago.
Is it still there?
Yes.
Okay, so let me mute and then come back. Still there?
Speak.
Okay. So this is the beginning of the definition. It's also follows.
It's still slightly there. Could you check your mic?
My mic looks good. It's saying.
Do you have another window open on your program?
No, but what I'm going to do is give me 1 second. I'm going to try to pull in a pair of headphones and hope that that helps. That helps resolve it. If I can just find what I do first. I'll use the latest airplane headphones that I have. Sorry about the interruption. Is that any better now?
Not completely better. You are understandable, so keep going.
Okay, I will try to do it this way. Hopefully that will improve. So we decided to continue with this definition of anti-Semitism. And as we put it through, it took, again, 3 years, as I mentioned, a lot of intense lobbying, and there were still some countries that were not happy that they ended up having to accept it, but it finally was adopted and became the first definition of anti-Semitism with any court, any sort of political status in the world. It is called a non-legally binding definition of anti-Semitism. And the reason, by the way, one of the reasons we use this existing EUMC definition with some tweaks and edits is because, given the wave of violence that you saw, for example, the example of synagogue in Wuppertal, and how long it took for the other definition, we didn't want to wait another 5 years to create a definition from scratch and deal with that, which may take an even longer process. So we really were in a rush, and we used what was out there already. So it's not legally binding. It is not a political or legal weapon. It cannot be used, from our perspective, to put someone in jail. There's no criminal aspect or code of it. It's a, it's working definition, again, not because it's not finished, but because it's meant as a practical definition. It's meant to assist people in a very specific manner. People who are working with issues related to anti-Semitism, whether it's a court, whether it's investigators, whether it's politicians or people in the media and so on and so forth, to help them understand what they're reporting on, what they're talking about, what they're working on. It is not an academic definition. I could have done a whole seminar on academic definitions that some of them are page long, some of them are almost book long. There are books devoted to defining anti-Semitism, and that's wonderful. That's in my DNA as well from my past, but that's not very practical when you're trying to explain why a firebombing of a synagogue should be considered an act of anti-Semitism. You're not going to give a book to the judge to look at like that. It does not define who is an anti-Semite or who is a Jew. It talks about manifestations of anti-Semitism. It's not getting into theoretical. It's very specific, very concrete. It's an educational resource in a prime sense of things. The 11 examples show religious bias, racial bias, political ideological bias, and Holocaust denial and distortion are all included. It allows for systemic tracking and general education on anti-Semitism and its forms. It's been adopted, endorsed, and recommended by, I think it's actually more than 24, I think it's close to 30 governments by now. And it's in use by the U.S. Department of State, posted on its website, and has called on its allies to use it. The Department of Education is using it, the European Union, the Organization of American States, the United Nations. It is also the basis of the executive order that was issued by President Trump, which is connected to the Department of Education. That executive order specified that if somebody brings a complaint about anti-Semitism under Title VI, which is the act that protects students on campus, and alleges an act of anti-Semitism, when that act is investigated, this definition should be one of the tools used to decide whether it was indeed an act of anti-Semitism, which then, if it was judged to be anti-Semitic, then it goes into the penalty phase of it. But in and of itself, it does not cause any action on any campus. And I think, again, we realize the need for the definition in our country, because if you look at some of the things, remember the Charlottesville rally, Unite the Right rally, where Jews will not replace us, and Nazi slogans. And again, we had a statement coming from the President of the United States at that time, and he did allege that it was misquoted, and that he walked back and tried to clarify it, but calling for, that there were very good people on both sides, which raised the question of what was understood, whether this was understood properly to be anti-Semitic or not. One of the examples listed as calling for aiding, justifying the killing or harming of Jews in the name of radical ideology or an extremist view of religion. These are two American neo-Nazi groups that have been responsible for a string of murders of Jews and some others, minority members in the United States. Most of these people, these groups have kind of been shut down by the government. There are a number of people awaiting prosecution. Some of them have now established connections at arms with international extremist groups, but they have used in the United States their anti-Semitic ideology to justify a number of murders. The spreading of conspiracy theories. Again, Parler, one of the social media sites. And we generally tend, when we talk about social media, we talk about Facebook and Google and YouTube. Those are actually companies that have made some efforts, some weaker, some stronger than others, to rein in some of the extremes of anti-Semitism and hate speech online. There are others, Parler, Telegram, Gab, etc., that have made no effort and pride themselves as being home for some of the worst speech in the United States or the world. And here, for example, remember, this exact same stereotype at Shoah of 2019, and this is alleging that Jews are behind a conspiracy on the attempt to accept more illegal immigrants into the United States. That was the motivation, if you recall, for the shooter at the Tree of Life synagogue, who was blamed highest, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, for increased immigration into the United States. Am I still clear? There is another.
Still echoing, but understandable.
Okay, I'll try to go. Another form of it is making mendacious, dehumanizing, demeaning allegations about Jews. We just talked about the power of collective Jews. Here you see Soros holding this is over Henry McMaster, Flynn, etc., Kelly, part of President Trump's former administration. But on top of it is a puppet master of the secret Jew, that even George Soros was a puppet being manipulated by the evil secret Jews controlling everything behind the scenes. Accusing Jews as a people for something committed by one individual. This man is actually a tragic figure. Herschel Greenspan was a young Jew whose parents were caught in no man's land between Germany and Poland in 1939, 1938. And Greenspan, in despair, went into the German legation in Paris and shot and murdered a Nazi diplomat there. The diplomat was made a martyr, and the Nazis used as the pretext for Kristallnacht, his murder, for the pretext as Kristallnacht in November 1938. So Greenspan's act was really used by the Nazis to blame the entire population, Jewish community of Germany. Using symbols associated with classical anti-Semitism to characterize Israel or Israelis. Here, very clear, the blue and white flag of Israel, the Star of David replaced by a swastika, or photoshopping of Holocaust survivors, alleging that Israel was committing murder and genocide in Gaza. Now, one of the things that's most controversial, in quotation marks, for some people at least, about our definition, is that our definition does include a number of examples related to anti-Semitism that's covered over as criticism of Israel today. And what we say very specifically and very clearly at the top of the definition is that criticism of Israel, as criticism of any other country, is perfectly legitimate. If you criticize a country's policies, actions, and so on and so forth, like people do in the US or UK or Canada or whatever, and Israel is one of those, that's fine. You have every right to do that. But when you go into the essentially creating a double standard, where you blame Israel for things that you don't criticize any other country for, or you delegitimize Israel, or you attempt to demonize Israel, things like that cross the line into anti-Semitism. That has become very controversial for some figures, particularly in the extreme progressive circle, who think or claim and allege that our definition is being used to stifle critics of Israel. I think, as you can see, that's far from the truth. Another form of classical anti-Semitism that is still around today is the blood libel. This is a scene from taken from Hugh of Lincoln, who is one of the original images of the blood libel, that Jews were murdering a Christian child, draining his blood for ritual purposes, and it was repeated a couple of years ago on an Arab TV station with an academic saying on Passover the Jews mixed the blood of Christian children into their matzah that they're making. So again, the same tropes still present today. You have other examples of this kind of ancient trope repeating itself. It's not, in this case, blood ritual directly, blood libel, but in this case, the allegation that Israel is using organ harvesting And what's interesting about this is that it shows how anti-Semitism, the same forms of anti-Semitism, sometimes appear on the extreme right and extreme left. So this was an extreme left publication, very much on the progressive side. The woman who wrote it was an anti-war activist from the Iraq War period, going back to the Bush administration. But then it was republished in the IHRA, which is the International Institute of Historical Review, which is the basis, the center of Holocaust denial, and it's run by a neo-Nazi. And they literally republished the same woman and the same article. Both you have it on the extreme right and on the extreme left. And again, just to show what concerns me a lot is the penetration of this anti-Semitism into issues of politics today in the United States. And you have a famous statement from Omar Ilhan, Congresswoman on the progressive side, alleging the double the jeopardy, meaning that Jews are more interested in the welfare of the state of Israel than they are in the United States. And here you have somebody, again, this was taken from the poison mushroom that I mentioned earlier, to show you that Jews are responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus. Here Jews are crucifying Palestinians, who is now the Jesus figure, the Star of David above the new crucifix. And to close with, I'm just going to close with a congresswoman. There's no other way to describe it. She's a member of Congress who, outside of the space laser quotes that you're all familiar with, this to me is even more dangerous, where she talks about an unholy alliance of leftists, capitalists, and Zionist supremacists. Look what she's putting together. Leftists and capitalists in the same category, together, Zionist supremacists. This is, the conspiracy theory of all conspiracy theories. And what are they doing? Promoting immigration, illegal immigration, and miscegenation, the mixture of races, the deliberate aim of bringing us out of existence in our own homelands. This was the woman who is now sitting in the halls of Congress, who, forget the space laser comments, but who has wrapped herself in the American flag and is spouting and has spouted and never really apologized for outright anti-Semitism. And so the question that we began with, why do we need a definition of anti-Semitism? And I'm not going to even get into international circles right now. I'll just say in the United States, we need it more desperately than ever before. Because when people in halls of Congress, in political figures of power, can both spout anti-Semitic statements and slogans, and then claim that they're not anti-Semitic at all, say that they're and be defended by people in their own parties, then we have an issue. And until we understand and are able to clearly define and point out what anti-Semitism is, until we begin by cleaning our own houses, if you're on the right, focus on the right. If you're on the left, focus on the left. Anti-Semitism should not be applied to your opponent because you've run out of things to say about their position on taxes or I don't know, any other hot button issue. Anti-Semitism needs to be clearly understood for the racism, for the bigotry, for the murderous impulse that it is. And if we don't understand it, if we don't clarify what it is, then we can't begin to fight. So for that reason, we've spent really an inordinate amount of time over the past couple of years pushing and working hard to get this definition of anti-Semitism. I mentioned there are some to be on the progressive side, even Jewish academics among them, who have attempted to undermine it by claiming that it is targeting critics of Israel. There is nothing in it, and I don't think there's any really concrete example where it can be used to legitimately to shut down freedom of speech. But it does offer a clarification and a protection on an international level, considering through the impact of social media and how globalized the world has become, how strongly anti-Semitism, even though we focus on the United States, has a global aspect. and international implications, more than ever before, we need a common baseline understanding of what anti-Semitism is to begin to fight successfully. And that is what this effort has been geared to. I've tried to give you, I think, some of the background of both what anti-Semitism is, where it came from, why we have this definition. And I hope we have enough time for some questions and comments at this moment.
We do have time for questions. As we switch over to that, Mark, you might just take a moment to check your internet connection, which was wavering a bit right at the end.
I'm going to leave that behind, and everything looks strong here. Everything looks strong there. Let's hope that it will last till the end. I apologize again for the echo. I've never had that before, and I'm not sure why it's there.
We do have some questions. You may have noticed the theme of our speaker series is why this matters. Could you just kind of sum up why your presentation and your history and definition of anti-Semitism matters to us now?
I think I'll do it try to be very succinct about it. I think for a few decades following World War II, or certainly from the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, we believe that anti-Semitism might have been an historical problem, but it was not a major problem in the United States. We even use the term American exceptionalism in regard to that, the idea that Jews here were living in an incredible, positive environment. I still think so. We are in an incredible positive environment. The United States historically has been the best friend and best place for Jews to live. But the last 3 or 4 years have seen an eruption of anti-Semitism that is historic, that has been violent, that has penetrated into high levels of government, and that I think has practical implications on our lives. The fact that we now have such increased security concerns about Jewish institutions, the fact that we worry about what people in Congress are saying about Jews or about Israel, not just talking about criticism of a specific policy or action, but in a broad sense of the very right to exist as Israel for Israel, or for Jews to live Jewish lives in the United States. I think that that's a sufficient answer to why it matters now and why we have to take it seriously in a way that perhaps we had the luxury of not doing before. I didn't even begin to address the issues on campuses, for example, where Jewish students on a number of campuses have found themselves frequently ostracized or under attack. There's so many directions in which we see anti-Semitism, which has always been present in American society from the very beginning of American society. I live in New York, and a lot you get to Peter Stuyvesant, who's one of the great heroes, founders of colonial, is the founder of colonial New York, New Amsterdam, and he tried to keep Jews out. He was a racist, a slave as well, but he had to be overruled by his bosses in Amsterdam to even allow Jews to enter this country. Balanced with that, and the predominance has been the effort led initiated, let's say, by George Washington, with his famous letter to the synagogue in Truro, saying that the Jews have a home in the United States, and that in many ways has been the dominant part of it. It would never face the waves of pogroms and state-sponsored anti-Semitism that existed in Europe, but there were certainly clauses and quotas and schools that Jews couldn't get into, and professions that Jews could work in, and so on and so forth. But somehow or other, that seemed to be in the past. What we're facing today is an eruption in a way that I don't think any of us anticipated, and we need tools to deal with it. And I think this is one of the most important tools that we have.
Just a comment from Sharon. As a Christian, to see this Pope's remarks makes me sick to my stomach. It is now considered a sin to think this way about Jews. Alas, maybe too little, too late.
That's a great point, and I really probably should have stressed it earlier. I think that the Catholic Church, and a lot of the Protestant churches as well, did an incredible revolution that we don't talk about and give enough credit to take and turn around 2,000 years of tradition in a way that maintains fidelity to their beliefs, but at the same time neutralizes and deals and confronts these terrible elements. I think it's extraordinary. I think it's a model for many of us, in our own lives, learn and turn to. And I think there have been just incredible revolutionary work done on this. I don't think it's given enough credit sometimes. And I thank Sharon for bringing that up and pointing that out. I think the Catholic Church institutionally is one of the strongest allies that we have in the fight against anti-Semitism today. I think there's certainly a lot of the Protestant world as well, a lot of just hugely influential and important allies. And I think we really need to recognize that. And again, I just thank Sharon for bringing that up.
Adam asks, in the 800 plus years since Pope Innocent III, when did the Roman Catholic Church's official position about Jews turn around, and what prompted the change?
Short answer to that is the change was prompted by the Holocaust. And the official turnaround began or took fruition in 1962 in Vatican II, particularly in the document known as Stereotypes, which sort of began to absolve the Jews today of the crime of deicide, killing Jesus 2,000 years ago. That, luckily, fortunately, to their credit, it did not stop with that. They kept building on it and building on it and building on it, talking about teaching of teaching anti-Semitism as a sin, and that they had to teach about the Holocaust. There have been bumps in the road. There have been times that we disagreed, and there have been segments of the Catholic Church, for example, that are in schism today, that are still anti-Semitic. I've written about that in part of my scholarly work. But on the whole, the organized Catholic Church has been evolving in this direction and continues to evolve in this direction. Every pope has built on the work of the popes before them, and again, I think it's an extraordinarily positive model. Unfortunately, as I said, it did take the Holocaust to really cause that to happen. And the other part of it is that I think that historians have come to realize, and I agree with this 100%, that those seeds that were planted in Christendom, let's put it that way, are still there in many ways that we don't think about. Those unconscious, that's what I was talking about earlier with the images at the Cathedral of Notre Dame. People don't even think twice about it, but they walk past it and they absorb it in some ways. And there are a lot of remnants. If you look at English literature from T.S. Eliot and Shakespeare and Ezra Pound and so on and so forth, there's overt anti-Semitism, there's anti-Semitism that's just sort of sprinkled there, and there's just a lot that's kind of lying dormant in the unconscious in very, very bad ways.
The term anti-Zionism is being characterized as the new anti-Semitism. Where does your organization stand on Holocaust institutions taking a stance on issues related to BDS?
It's something I'm not even sure our organization would say in a sense, but I will tell you that I think, first of all, that it's, let me put it this way. Every organization, every institution can certainly use and make its own policy and its own decisions, and has every right to do that. BDS is an attempt to destroy the state of Israel, to delegitimize it, I think crosses over the line into anti-Semitism. If you're talking about a Holocaust institution that is meant to carry the message of the Holocaust, that there is such a thing, that Jewish life should be protected, as any other lies. There's no question about that. We're talking about a very specific topic at this point. Then you get to a situation where things that are counter to that, that have every right to be called out, whether that is part of the mission, whether the institution chooses to do that, in many ways it's up to them. But I certainly would support the right of any institution that deals with the Holocaust and is extending that to current day issues to certainly look at and judge BDS accordingly.
Thank you very much for your enlightening and excellent presentation. Let me turn the floor over to Jillian Howell for some closing remarks.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Mr. Weitzman, for your presentation. Very informative, very enlightening. In wrapping up, I would just like to highlight a few relevant areas of our museum expansion project and kind of bring tonight's presentation back into the work that we are doing as an institution. Of course, we cannot discuss the Holocaust without discussing anti-Semitism. And in the updated exhibit, we actually have an entire gallery dedicated to providing a historical overview of anti-Semitism, from the deeply ingrained religious prejudice through to racial anti-Semitism. And this is a really exciting addition to our offerings and will help visitors place the events of the Holocaust on this broader ongoing timeline, hopefully helping to get across that point that there was not good, then a lot of bad, then good, but things have happened on a spectrum historically. Additionally, we have a vast collection of oral histories that detail personal experiences with a range of anti-Semitic attitudes that we are putting to use in the exhibit, from the most explicit acts of violence occurring in Europe during the Holocaust to experiences like those of Sam Goldman, who was a fourth grader in Festus, Missouri in 1940, who had to sit inside during recess because the other children would taunt him as a Christ killer. And I think that all of these just really give us both that historical representation of the reality of anti-Semitism and remind us that distorted, manipulative thinking is something we should all be cognizant of in our interactions with the broader world, and really help to highlight the capacity for important and relevant work that the museum has 75 years after the Holocaust. And this will conclude tonight's program. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we hope to see you at the next lecture in our Why This Matters series. It's the vital need for Holocaust education. It will occur next Tuesday, August 10th at 6:30. Have a great evening, everyone.